Okay, well, it's great to be with you today, and I do not like PowerPoint charts, so you will have no PowerPoint charts. That's not to say that they're not useful sometimes, but I just typically don't use them. I'm going to talk for like 12 to 15 minutes and then open it up to questions, and I think you'll probably have quite a few questions. And what I'm going to do, just very briefly, is read a couple of paragraphs from the introduction to the 809 Commission Volume 2 report, which will come out in about a month. I just spent 2 days locked up with the commissioners, wrestling through all the issues that we're going to put in the Volume 2 report. I'll describe that process a little bit. But the first thing I'm going to do is just read you a couple of paragraphs out of that report, because it gives you the specific language on what we were asked to do as the 809 Commission in the 2016 NDAA. As Rich said, I spend currently about half my time at DAU, and then about half my time doing the 809 Commission. I'm probably going to take it up even a little level from what General Bunch said at lunchtime. And as I told General Whaley, who I've known for a long time, at this stage of my life, I don't worry about attribution or who I may offend. I just tell you what I think. And my comments will be fairly blunt, because we have a real challenge, and I'll talk about what that is in just a minute. So the 2016 NDAA tasked the 809 panel with reviewing and recommending amendment or repeal of regulations necessary to streamline defense acquisition processes, improve the system's efficiency and effectiveness, and maintain the U.S. Department of Defense's technological advantage. Very broad statements you would expect. The panel's tasked with making recommendations necessary to ensure defense acquisition system establishes the appropriate relationships between government and industry, improves function, maintains financial and ethical integrity, and protects DOD's best interests. And so before I read you another paragraph, there's probably been over 150 acquisition reform reports in the last 35 years. A glutton for punishment. I've either read all of them completely or I've significantly delved into them before even the 809 Commission got started. And it's kind of a corny joke, but acquisition reform is kind of the second oldest profession. It really is. And defense acquisition, as the panel is looking at it, is comprised of three core elements within the wider framework that allows defense acquisition to account for fundamental system practices, not necessarily exclusive to these core elements. And as you would expect, we define it as big A acquisition. That's requirements, funding, budget processes, and procurement. And I digress a little bit. I think you should measure both parts of the pulp, because you should not let the requirements community off the hook. So I would measure when you get a reasonable requirements package that describes what they need with performance specs that you can then turn into a contract. But I'll answer that question if it comes from the audience. But right now, the bottom line up front is I think most of the problem with defense acquisition over the years is in the requirements community and not in the little a acquisition contracting program management community. And I don't just say that personal opinion, I say that is shared by my fellow commissioners to a person. So we're looking at the framework. The thing we were wrestling with the last couple of days is we're touching every aspect of the defense acquisition system. I mean, literally every aspect. And we didn't start out with the framework. You could argue we probably should have, but we realized we've got all these things that are really, good ideas, impactful to change the system, but we need to hang them all together so there's a logical framework around which to put all these recommendations. And as you would expect, the framework we're looking at right now and the 30 pages I've got to read one more time tonight are about strategy, structure, processes and procedures, resources, and culture, because you got to touch the culture. We got started in August of, this is indicative of the DoD process today, which is damningly slow. We got started in August of 2016, okay? We didn't get to work until January of 2016 because we had to hire a little bit of staff, and the staff is absolutely great. Some of them are on loan from the different services or the defense agencies. Some of them are from industry on loan for a significant period of time. Some of them people are doing work that's pro bono. I mean, literally that committed to making change in the system that they're doing this without compensation. But the point I'm getting to about the slowness of DOD, so we knew what the hiring authority we should use to hire the full-time staff that we hired and to pay the commissioners that weren't already working for industry or working for the Defense Department in some other capacity. We knew what that hiring authority was because there's previous commissions that have used it. It took the DOD, HR, and legal community 6 months to make a decision on what hiring authority they used. They stopped paying people 2 months after we got started until they made up their mind. And the previous chair of the commission, Dee Lee, who got us through the Volume 1 report this past January, was daily emails, weekly meetings, et cetera. And 6 months after they got the package, they made a decision, and you know what hiring authority they decided to use? The one we started with in the first place. And to me, that is it's a damning indictment of the bureaucracy in DOD writ large that doesn't value time and the time value of money like you do in industry. And that's a recurring theme you'll see in the recommendations in the report that we've already written. I know a lot of people probably have told you this, but I think the current national defense strategy is probably the best one I've seen in my entire career. And I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the words that are in there because it impacts defense acquisition. Long-term strategic competition. Don't kid yourself, and I'm going to talk a little bit about China and Russia in a minute. We are back in great power competition. Absolutely 100% convinced, and just about everybody I talk to at the higher levels believes the same thing. China and Russia, I mentioned already. We need to increase competitiveness and restore dominance by increasing lethality. These are quotes out of the National Defense Strategy. Rebuild readiness and attract new partners by reforming business practices to improve performance and affordability. General Mattis, the Defense Secretary, has absolutely been clear. Those are his 3 priorities, right? Lethality, readiness, partners, and then reform and lethality and readiness go together, and then reforming the business practices. And now the number 3 senior executive in the Defense Department is not the AT&L anymore, it's the Chief Management Officer who is looking at 8, I would call them back office, not in a pejorative way, but the financial system, logistics system, the healthcare system, I can go right down the list, information technology, looking at fundamental changes to those systems because it's absolutely necessary in order to generate the capital and be able to do what the Defense Department needs to do. So just a couple bullets out of the National Defense Strategy: deliver performance at the speed of relevance, organize for innovation, the split up of AT&L. You now have Dr. Griffin heading the research and engineering part, drive budget discipline and affordability, streamline rapid iterative approaches from development to fielding, and harness and protect the national security innovation base. One of the things that we did is we came up with 5 attributes, and I'm going to read those 5 attributes. So everything that we look at and analyze, we grade against those 5 attributes, and you have to hit at least one, hopefully all 5 of them. And those 5 attributes are: for an outcomes-based acquisition system, competition and collaboration, adaption and responsiveness, transparency, time sensitivity, key issue, and the allowance for trade-offs. So the commissioners, there are 16 of them, probably 400 years of collective experience. The 3 senior procurement executives for the Army, Navy, and Air Force, Elliott Branch, the deputy, really, he was the acting for a while, Mike Hoskins from the Army, and Casey Blake from the Air Force, who retires next week, are all panel members. Former head of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, Al Berman, and I can just go right down the list. Not just contracting, but people that have program management background, a couple of lawyers, long-term procurement, law expertise, both private sector, a number of industry reps. As an example, for the Air Force folks, Darrell Scott, who retired two-star from the Air Force as a senior procurement executive and just retired as a senior vice president for contracts for Boeing, is on the panel, even though he just left Boeing within the last week. He's going to stay with the panel. So just tremendous amount of expertise on how this system should look. And so we're looking at the system very, very broadly. Why do I think this one is different than the other 150 acquisition reform reports? One of the pro bono folks is a guy by the name of Bob Cover, who spent his career on Capitol Hill taking committee reports and turning them into statute language. And another one of our commissioners is a great person by the name of Kathy Garman, who spent her career as a staffer on the Hill. So we get done making a recommendation that gets voted on by the commissioners, and this is the National Championship Debate Club when we go to debate, because just like the doctor, the first thing is you want to do no harm to the existing system. Every one of those recommendations is researched thoroughly, cited, has data and analysis behind it, and then we make a recommendation for a legislative change. We actually write the statute or change the existing statute. So as an example, in the first volume of our 3-volume report, January of 18, 4 weeks from now, the end of June, and January of 19, you got to take all 3 volumes to get the totality of what we're looking at and recommending. There's 642 pages. Over half of those pages are the change in the statute language that goes with that. And why do we think that's successful? Congressman Thornberry, chairman of the HASC, picked up about 75% of what was in that report for a standalone bill that now is the House version of the next NDAA. And that doesn't mean he's not going to pick up the other 25%, or the Senate won't, but the way we are operating is significantly different. You know, I've read, like I said, every one of those acquisition reports before, and it doesn't do much good to say you should cut down contracting time. Yeah, great recommendation, but how do you implement it? How do you operationalize it? And so it's not just the statute too, it's also the regulations. So we've broken ourselves into teams. There's 11 teams. I won't necessarily cover all of them, but when I tell somebody it's a 634-page Volume 1 report, it's a good read, they look at you like, are you out of your mind? But pick and choose what's in there. And I'll just cover a couple things that were in the January report, and then I'll kind of open it up for questions. But marketplace framework. One of the things that we're doing, because the analysis tells you that 93% of the transactions exclude what Transcom does, because that's not in the figure I'm just about to give you, but 93% of the transactions in DoD are under $7 million. So the SAP is now $250,000. I think you're going to see us in June say the SAP ought to be $7 million, and maybe even higher than that, because if you go up to $15 million, you capture damn near all of it. So 93% of the transactions, but where's most of the dollars? They're in the 7%. They're in the major weapon systems. So why don't you make the simple things simple? You know, there's 23,000 PCOs in the Defense Department, procurement contracting officers. Wouldn't it be like to do 93% of the transactions, was maybe 1,000 of those, and free up the other 22,000 to go work on the complicated things? It's the division of labor. Commercial buying, the expert in the country on commercial buying, and we spent 3 hours yesterday, and he's changing the FAR so that the commercial buying procedures don't have 160 clauses you should consider putting in commercial buying, rolling it back to what was in the 90s, and then changing and redoing the FAR so that the commercial buying provisions are all referenced in Part 12 and not scattered all over the FAR like they are today. Contract compliance and audit. Significant criticism of DCAA in the January report. Our thoughts are to professionalize DCAA, use independent auditors from the big four auditing firms. I was the guy when we were debating what we should say about DCAA. I said, give them a timestamp. Everything that they do ought to have, a 3, 6, no more than a year timestamp to get their work done. Because everybody in the Defense Department, you got to value time. You got to work through the backlog. And it's just crazy that it takes DCAA that long, and they've got backlogs of 5 and 6 years. I mean, it's unconscionable to me and my fellow commissioners that we would let them do that. And to create a best practice guide so we professionalize the auditors, as an example. Defense business systems. If you want to see where we're going with portfolios, and so the thought here is get the acquisition, the AT&L, out of defense business systems, let the CMO run with that to the 8 back office things that they're looking at right now, create a portfolio of capabilities, and when you're doing a software system, how do you make a distinction between what's RDT&E, procurement, and O&M? So try to get rid of the colors of money to have agile and DevOps software practices that are state-of-the-art the way everybody else does it today in the commercial sector. Touching on services contracting in a major way, we're going to recommend eliminating the distinction between personal services contracting because it's a huge complicator. Some work on that. Small business. I know there's some small business folks out here, but the way DOD measures small business is completely input-based. How many dollars do I put on contract in the different categories? Why isn't there a small business strategy that says, this is what I want from the small business community? And so there's a real strong recommendation there for the department to write a small business strategy and to harness the small business offices and the PTACs, which are the liaison in DLA with the small business community, so that people know how to do business with DOD. Because we've lost well over 100,000 small businesses in the last 5 years that no longer do business with DOD because it's just too hard. And those are the companies we want to try to recruit back. Statutory offices, we recommended about 26, maybe 27 offices in the DOD that have a statutory basis. Eliminate the statutory basis. Doesn't mean the office necessarily needs to go away, but let the SecDef decide if he needs that office. But when you put it in statute, you get an office, you get the head of that office, and then you get a deputy, and then you get an assistant, and then you get an EA, and then you get a staff, and then you get a service contract, and it just blossoms and blossoms and blossoms. And then statutory reporting requirements, everything should be 5 years or less. After 5 years, it expires. And we recommended, when we looked at 28 different reporting requirements, sunsetting 20 of them right away. 3 of them should stay in place. Example, long-term shipbuilding program. Makes sense to have a long-term shipbuilding program if you're the Navy. And then 5 other of the reporting requirements would sunset in 2021. Why is this important? Because we are back in great power competition. And then let me talk about money for just a second. So I was the Army's programmer as the deputy in the primary for a total of 5 years. That is not a fun job. That is not a fun job at all. But so right now, DOD is sort of flush with cash, right? How many years in a row have we had CRs? 10, right? And probably 17 out of the last 20 years we've had CRs. So to your budget, what happens in 2020 if the BCA kicks back in? From FY19 to FY20, DOD's top line goes down by $71 billion. Okay. Now, is everybody assuming that we're going to get that to go back up again? With our political system today, I wouldn't bet on anything. I wouldn't bet on anything. And that's a 13% reduction. And if you fence off military pay and you fence off the health care costs, that's a 20% reduction in 2020. So from a contracting perspective, and from a readiness perspective, I think we're going to fall off the cliff again. Now, there's been a lot of promises made by current committee chairs that no, it's going to go back up. But if you watch like I do what's happened over the last 10 years, I wouldn't bet that the budget's going to go back up in 2020, and I wouldn't bet it's going to go back up on time. And as a taxpayer, I wouldn't give DOD any more money, because one of our biggest problems, and why the Chinese potentially are the major threat, is because their economy is as strong, if not stronger, and getting even stronger. And the Chinese don't play fair. They don't have patent laws. They don't have all the protections that we do. They don't innovate as well as we do, but they steal you blind, and they certainly apply it. That's a strategic threat, in my opinion. They're ahead of us in hypersonics right now. That's a major threat from Dr. Griffin and R&E. And so we're back in great power competition. And why does acquisition have to speed itself up? You got to speed things up. That doesn't mean quality goes down. That doesn't mean cost goes up. But you got to value time. You got to put some speed back into the system. Why do you have all these authorities now for these middle tier acquisition authorities? And why do you have all these rapid capability offices? Why isn't the normal system as rapid as the rapid capability offices you've got in all the services right now? It's because you've got too many people. Why do you have an unlimited warrant PCO that has to go through 7 levels of review in order to let a contract? Okay, that's a fair question. Why does it take, and we're looking at the requirements process too. Frankly, most of our debate is get rid of the requirements process, get rid of JSIDs completely. And if I was taking 100%, the problems in defense acquisition today, I would say, are 2/3 based on poor requirements and people that write requirements not understanding what it takes to get a performance spec and know how to measure that. I would say about 25% is the budget process and the control that the appropriators have and the comptroller has to micromanage dollars. And I think about 10% of it is really the small a acquisition part. So with that, I'll take a few questions and we'll go from there. Yes, sir.